Welcome to Banyen Books, Branches of Wisdom, celebrating the joy of bright ideas and heartful lifelong learning. Branches of Wisdom is a series of intimate conversations with the world's most influential authors and visionaries. We explore spirituality and the human mind, ecology and culture. Most episodes are recorded with a live audience. You can join our live events and submit questions to your favorite guests. Check out our upcoming schedule at banyen.com. Since 1970, Banyen Books has been a rich oasis at the crossroads of wisdom and philosophy, offering resources for humanity's evolving paths. We're a locally owned, independent bookstore in the heart of Vancouver's Kitsilano neighborhood. Visit us in person or shop online at banyen.com. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews for the podcast. And now, enjoy.
Hello and welcome. My name is Jacob Steele, the events curator producer for Banyen Books and Sound. Today, we are delighted to be hosting fermentation master Sandor Katz for a presentation on his new book, Sandor Katz's Fermentation Journeys. Sandor Katz is a fermentation revivalist. He is a James Beard Award winner and a New York Times bestselling author of 4 previous books, including Wild Fermentation, The Revolution Will Not Be Microwaved, The Art of Fermentation, and Fermentation as Metaphor. The hundreds of fermentation workshops he has taught around the world have helped catalyze a broad revival of the fermentation arts. He has been described as the high priest of fermentation by the New Yorker and as a fermentation master by the Wall Street Journal. His new book, Sandor Katz's Fermentation Journeys, features the recipes, processes, cultural traditions, and stories from around the globe that inspire his life's work. It is a cookbook and more, destined to become a modern classic essential for every home chef. You can learn more about Sandor's work at wildfermentation.com. Without further ado, I present to you Sandor Katz.
All right. Thank you so much, Jacob. Thank you to people around Vancouver and beyond who are with us today. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my new book and how I came to write it, and tell a little bit about my journey. But I'm going to really keep my presentation relatively short. I have a few show and tell items. I'm going to, pull out some fermentation projects to talk about. But I want to keep my presentation relatively short in order to maximize the time that we have available for, more interaction, to hear, what's on your mind. And certainly it'll be, more satisfying for you and more interesting for me, if we talk about the things that are on your mind. But I'll just start by giving a little overview of this is my new book. I get to just call it Fermentation Journeys. It's a book that I've really been thinking about for, I don't know, maybe over the last 10 years or so. Basically, the story of how I fell into fermentation. I did not, as a child, think I was going to be a fermentation revivalist and write about fermentation. Like almost every human being in almost every part of the world, I enjoyed certain flavors of fermentation. We always had yogurt in the refrigerator. I liked yogurt. As a kid, I had a reputation for loving pickles. I didn't know how they were made. I wasn't thinking about fermentation, but I was very drawn to the flavor of the kinds of pickles that we ate in my family, which would be, in New York, we call them sour pickles. Outside of New York, they're generally referred to as kosher dills. Basically they're cucumbers fermented in a saltwater brine with garlic, dill, sometimes chili peppers, sometimes grape leaves to help keep them crunchy. And the flavor is lactic acid. Now, I didn't know this when I was a kid, but I would eat pickles at some of my friends' houses. I would see the pickles in the supermarket and, sometimes try those. And they had a very different flavor, which I now can say is a vinegar pickle. There's different ways of achieving a pickle, but anyway, I love pickles. In my mid-20s, I spent a couple of years following a macrobiotic diet, and macrobiotics places an emphasis on the digestive benefit of pickles and other live ferments. And so, these foods that I'd always loved to eat because they were so delicious, suddenly I had like an ideology, this idea that they, help improve digestion, maybe that they help improve overall immune function. And, I started really seeking out these foods on a regular basis, just to be supportive of good health. But I still wasn't making them myself. And what really made it relevant for me to learn how to make them myself is I moved in 1993. 1993, yeah, sure. At just before I turned 31, I moved from New York to rural Tennessee, and among the changes in my life at that moment is I started gardening. And the first season in the garden, that's when I had a practical reason to learn about fermentation, because I was such a naive city kid. It had never occurred to me that in the garden all the radishes would be ready at about the same time, all the cabbages would be ready at about the same time. So when we had a nice row of cabbages, I decided it was time for me to learn how to make sauerkraut. I knew sauerkraut had something to do with preservation, so it seemed like the thing to do with a bunch of cabbage all at once. And I looked in The Joy of Cooking, and I learned how to make sauerkraut from The Joy of Cooking. It was deceptively simple: chop vegetables, salt them, season them if you like, get them juicy, pack them into a jar or a crock. And then after that first batch was so delicious, I just started experimenting. I'm sort of constitutionally unable to follow a recipe exactly. So, I just started playing around with different vegetables. What happens if you add carrots? What happens if you add turnips? What if you use a different kind of seasoning? What if you vary the amount of salt? And I just started experimenting, and I also learned how to make yogurt, and I played around with country winemaking, and sort of slowly I became obsessed with the whole idea of fermentation, and started looking in books from different cuisines around the world to try to learn about fermentation processes in those parts of the world. And the first few years it was largely a personal obsession that I shared with my friends. Then I got a reputation. A friend started calling me Sandor Kraut because I was always showing up with sauerkraut. And I got invited to teach. Some people I knew who live in a community who were organizing what they described as a food Skillshare event invited me to teach a sauerkraut making workshop. And that was really interesting. I mean, it was fun to demystify the process for people, but it also, people's questions forced me to do some more research about this process. So for instance, I never had been concerned about the safety of it, but, people started, holding up jars of vegetables that we'd shredded and saying, how can I be sure I have good bacteria growing in here and not something dangerous? And so, that forced me to do a little bit of research to be able to answer people's questions. It turns out, fermented vegetables are about the safest food we know. I mean, statistically, vegetables are much safer after they have been fermented than they are when they are raw, because the process protects. I mean, even if they happen to have been exposed to cells of, some organism that could potentially be pathogenic to us, the great likelihood is that in the fermentation, the lactic acid bacteria would dominate, and as they acidify the environment, they would destroy the pathogens. It's just very convenient for us that the pathogens that are worrisome and can hurt us can't tolerate an acidic environment. So anyway, I mean, it was fun for me to learn, to teach, and it forced me to learn more. And I did this 1998, 1999, 2000, and 2001. I had a conflict and I couldn't make this annual event, and I really felt terrible about it. And as a result, I spent a month writing down all of my fermentation recipes, and I produced a little zine. that I self-published. There's not an illustration in it. It's just, sort of recipes and me talking about the foods. And, I called this Wild Fermentation, but it was Wild Fermentation, a do-it-yourself guide to cultural manipulation. So anyway, that is what became Wild Fermentation. I organized a book tour. My book tour for Wild Fermentation from 2003 somehow never ended because, as I knew from the start, there are people who are passionately interested in fermentation. There are people who are very curious about fermentation. Fermentation is something that affects everybody's life, but like all aspects of food production, it's largely disappeared from the fabric of our communities. So it's just mysterious to people. And people, because most of us have been taught to be fearful of bacteria, people project that anxiety onto the process of fermentation, which is not rocket science, and which is like a set of disparate practices that always have practical benefit to people. A preservation method would not be practiced year after year after year if there was a 75% or a 90% success rate, meaning that a 25% chance or a 10% chance that it could make people sick. So, all of these are processes for safety and other practical benefits, preservation. Sauerkraut, yogurt, cheese, these are all, strategies for, preserving abundance to eat at some other period of the year where there's not so much abundance. That's not the only practical benefit. Fermentation pre-digests food and makes nutrients more bioavailable to us. It breaks down certain toxic compounds and generates some additional beneficial compounds. And then there's the probiotics. We're learning more and more about how important bacteria are to our health and well-being, to every aspect of our physiology. The trillion bacteria that are in residence in our bodies, in great biodiversity, but importantly, in less biodiversity than people in the past had, as a result of chemical exposure, as a result of diets with more processed food and less fiber. We are experiencing narrowing biodiversity in the gut, and we're not sure all of the sort of collective health problems that we experience are related to that, but many of them are. And so, this idea of diversifying gut bacteria, can potentially improve every aspect of our health. Certainly it can improve digestion and immune function. There's some new evidence that it can potentially shift our brain chemistry and improve our mental health. But, no aspect of our existence, our well-being, our health is apart from, this community of bacteria that are part of us that we can replenish with the help of fermented foods and beverages. So, I've been teaching about fermentation, since 1998, since Wild Fermentation came out in 2003. I've traveled all around. Increasingly through the years, I've been invited further and further away. At this point, I've taught in probably 25 countries, nearly all the states of the US, the majority of the provinces of Canada. And all along I've been, I've been eating also. And so learning about foods in different parts of the world, learning about beverages, learning how they're made. And, I always knew eventually I'd write a book about foods and beverages that I encountered in my travels. But, at the beginning of 2020, I had all these plans. I started the year teaching in Australia and New Zealand. I had plans to teach in Peru. I had plans to teach in Yukon, in Iceland. I had plans to travel to Taiwan. So, I just figured this book was somewhere in the future, and then everything got canceled. And so, this book I really, kind of, wrote when I was at home during COVID. My kitchen was bubbling with, things that I had seen made, but, suddenly I had to like up my game and write recipes for them. And so this is a book about ferments of my travels. And originally I conceptualized that I would organize it geographically and say like, this is my trip to Japan. This is my trip to Colombia. But as I began a book structured in that way, I realized that, my strength as a fermentation generalist is in connecting the dots. And, it's really like the similarities and the distinctions between similar foods in different places that is most interesting to me. And so, I ended up deciding to organize the book thematically instead. So there's a chapter on fermenting vegetables. There's a chapter on fermenting grains. There's a chapter on fermenting beans. And so the type of food gets a cross-cultural treatment. So anyway, I can go on and on. I have show and tell items, but it looks like there's a lot of questions, and maybe if we just jump into some of the questions, then I'll bring my show and tell items to bear as they are relevant to things that people want to talk about.
Okay, so let's begin with BB. What is the ideal salt percentage for fermentation, or do different fermentations require different percentages?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, fermentation is a vast, vast, vast world, and all kinds of ferments don't use any kind of salt, right? Like, you don't put salt in wine when you're fermenting wine, typically. But certain ferments, you generally use salt. So, the fermentation of vegetables, I mean, I typically use salt. There definitely are examples in the world of people who are fermenting vegetables in places that have not historically had, easy access to salt. There are ways that people ferment vegetables without any salt, but salt provides a lot of benefits. Salt hardens pectins to make vegetables more crispy and crunchy. Salt inhibits enzymes that break down pectins that can make vegetables get very soft and mushy. So if you're trying to ferment without any salt or with very small proportions of salt, you're likely to have more success in a cooler environment than in a warmer environment. And you're also more likely to have success in a fermentation of a limited length of time rather than one with a very long length of time. Generally, if I'm dry salting the sauerkraut method, I mean, when I meet people whose great grandparents were making sauerkraut, like usually they make a salty sauerkraut because, you go back a couple of generations and, this was an important survival food. And, this might be the only vegetables that people would see for the next, 6 months or something. And so, if people had access to salt in a situation like that, they would often salt it rather heavily. But if you're, doing this in 2021, not so much for survival through a long, harsh winter, but more to have something delicious that you and your family are going to enjoy eating, to derive the benefit of probiotics and have this nutritious food at the ready anytime. I mean, and you're going to be fermenting it for a relatively short period of time and then storing it in a refrigerator. I mean, you can use really exceedingly small proportions of salt. So, I mean, I'm all over the place with salt. Like, when I make things in the summer, I live in a place that's much hotter than Vancouver. I use more salt because salt slows things down. I mean, certainly when I make the beloved, cucumber pickles, sour pickles of my youth, I mean, I usually mix up a 5% brine. So now part of that is that that's just accounting for the water, not the vegetables. And you want to use as little brine as possible to cover the vegetables. So, that ends up being about 2.5% salt once you pour it over the vegetables and the salt absorbs into the vegetables. But I'm starting with a fairly strong brine, like, for a liter of water, 50 grams of salt. For a quart, if you're doing it with a tablespoon, that would be about 3 tablespoons of salt. If I'm dry salting vegetables where it's not going to be diluted, then I'll always do much lower. Like a high salt would be maybe like 2.5% salt. But this is not rocket science. If you're producing a commercial product that where every batch needs to be the same, then obviously you do need to weigh your ingredients and weigh your salt simply for consistency. But if you're doing this for your own, I assume that like if you make lentil soup or onion soup, you are not weighing the salt when you salt it. You're putting a little bit of salt in, you're mixing it, you're tasting it, and you're doing subjective evaluation. Does that need more salt? That's how I do sauerkraut. I lightly salt as I'm shredding the vegetables, and then I mix it all together, and then I just taste a little piece. And I just think to myself, is that enough salt? Does that taste good to me? Or would I be happier if there was more salt? It's always easier to add salt than it is to subtract salt. So I hope that that sort of answers the question. A lot of questions in fermentation like don't have like an absolute answer. There's very few questions that have absolute answers in the realm of fermentation because, it's such disparate practices that people do everything in a lot of different ways. And so, someone might offer you an absolute answer like, oh, you need 2.25% salt, but like I guarantee you that is not the whole story.
Thank you. So Sharon asks, I just received the new book, or she writes, I just received the new book. I'm a complete beginner. Couple of questions. So first one, are ferments such as regular pickles good for digestion? Or from a fermentation perspective, is there a specific process to augment the probiotic factor? And then her second question is, what is the best way to start? I'm particularly interested in sauerkraut.
Yeah, and sauerkraut is just the perfect place to start. It's just easy. So, okay, when we talk about pickles, we're talking about a few different things. A pickle is anything preserved in an acidic medium. So, North American supermarket shelves are filled with, shelf-stable jars of, vegetables, other things, eggs, pig's feet, you name it, anything that can be preserved in an acidic medium, you'll find it in supermarkets, but generally it's a hot vinegar solution poured over the cucumbers or the eggs or the pig's feet or whatever. And so that's a pickle. That's preserved in an acidic medium. It's not particularly alive because the vinegar was hot and generally it was heat processed. But like the pickles that I grew up with, in a delicatessen out of a barrel, so vegetables that were in a saltwater brine, that's also a pickle because the lactic acid bacteria that are on the vegetables, they're on all vegetables, they're on all plants growing out of soil on planet Earth. Lactic acid bacteria are basically metabolizing carbohydrates in the vegetables and turning them into lactic acid. And so over time, lactic acid is building up in there and it's acidifying and preserving the vegetables. That latter kind where the acid is derived from a fermentation of the vegetables is definitely like where you're going to find the best probiotics, at least from fermented vegetables. I mean, there's other fermented foods that have probiotics. I mean, the key is you want to eat things that are fermented and then not cooked or heat processed after their fermentation. So, let's take sourdough. If you want to eat a sourdough dough raw, that's teeming with probiotics, but who wants to eat raw dough? It just doesn't taste very good. After you bake it into bread, it's delicious, but because of the high heat, it's no longer alive. So just certain foods lend themselves more easily to live culture consumption than others. But fermented vegetables are the perfect way to start. Sauerkraut is the easiest method, but certainly not the only method. And, one of the themes that I explore in my new book is Chinese methods of fermenting vegetables. And, as someone who's been, thinking a lot about sauerkraut for half of my life, the story that is repeated throughout the literature is this idea that the idea of fermenting vegetables in a salty environment comes from China, and that it's nomadic people of Central Asia that witnessed it in China and brought the idea westward through Central Asia and into Eastern Europe. And so I always sort of had the idea that I wanted to go to China and try to learn something about, the roots of vegetable fermentation. And in 2016, a Chinese American friend invited me to go to China with her mother. And, we had a beautiful, beautiful trip. I learned so much, but I learned, among many other things, some great Chinese methods for fermenting vegetables that are not quite like sauerkraut. They're their own thing. But this is a style called Pao Tsai. And this is a brine. It's turned pink because I put some purple daikon in a few weeks ago, and the pigment from the daikons has gone into the brine and given it some color. But this is a spiced brine. It has ginger, and these are called black cardamom. It has some chili peppers. It has Szechuan peppercorns. And then the first batch of vegetables that I put in, I left for about 2 weeks, but now this is months old. And now I really just put vegetables in for, a few days or maybe a week at most. And, over time I've added more. I just recently added more ginger and chilies and Szechuan peppercorns to the brine. You have to add more salt because salt absorbs into the vegetables, and every vegetable you take out, some salt migrates out with it. But this has been so fun having like a perpetual brine like this. So all I'm saying is there's a lot of different ways you can ferment vegetables. I absolutely recommend sauerkraut as, just the easiest, most straightforward way to start. But, it's the beginning of the process. It's not the end of the process. And especially in Fermentation Journeys, my new book, I really sort of go into some, different styles of fermenting vegetables that I think, people who have been making sauerkraut will enjoy kind of mixing it up.
Oh, that looks delicious, by the way. So Aya asks, she says, thanks for the event. I've been trying to reduce electricity use, but I'm not being successful with fermented foods like miso, amazaki, soya sauce, pickles, kimchi, etc. How far can you manage your ferment without using a fridge? And any tips for natural temperature, long-lasting for good taste?
Yeah, sure. So, you don't need a fridge for any fermenting. If you are one of the people like living on the margins of, a modern North American society without a refrigerator, more power to you. You need fermentation more than any of the rest of us. Now, having a fridge gives you wide latitude. We could conceptualize our fridges as fermentation slowing devices in our kitchens, because that's what they do. That's how they preserve food, is they're just a cooler temperature. So all the microbes and all the enzymes that can potentially decompose our food or degrade our food are simply slowed down by being in a cooler environment. And microorganisms and enzymes metabolize faster in warmer environments and more slowly in cooler environments. So, without the refrigerator, you have to be strategic. So first of all, just the summer is its own time. You don't need to preserve food in the summer because there's lots of fresh food in the summer. So you have to think about, the cooler parts of the year being the parts of the year that you're able to preserve food. And, you might not be able to do things that go for years and then you have a lot of them. But something like soy sauce, you don't need a fridge. I don't keep soy sauce in my refrigerator. I just keep it out at ambient temperature. And right now, this is soy sauce that I just bottled this year, and I made it in 2019. So this is 2-year-old soy sauce. And the bottle is probably from some soy sauce that I bought, but this is what I made. And you don't need a refrigerator for it. Now, miso, if you have a cellar, a cellar is history's refrigerator. It's like the place that stayed the earth temperature. So, in certain places in the world, you can't have cellars because the groundwater is too high. But in places where you can have cellars, that's the place that stays more or less the earth temperature all the time. So in the summertime, that's a cool spot where you can store things. And in the wintertime, that's a relatively warm spot where you can store things. But in any case, it's always like has a moderating effect on the temperature. So whether you're like, curing meat or aging cheese or aging miso, these processes can happen much more slowly at the earth temperatures of a cellar than they will, in your house that's either getting hot in the summertime or you're heating it to be comfortable in the wintertime. But you don't need a refrigerator. And one thing is you can, especially in like coastal area, like coastal British Columbia, it doesn't get that cold outside either. I mean, I actually, in coastal Alaska, I visited this community where they were making miso, and they were storing the miso outside in coastal Alaska. And they were able to do that because they're in a place that doesn't get like super cold, and the miso is very salty, so like it doesn't freeze. Like if the temperature gets below freezing, even significantly below freezing for a short time, it's not gonna be able to freeze the miso. So I mean, I would just encourage you to think about like, that most of these foods don't really need the refrigerator. Now, they might last longer in the refrigerator, they might stay fresh longer in the refrigerator, but most of them can be maintained perfectly well at ambient temperatures, although sometimes for more limited periods of time. But things that are salty, acidic, and aged, things like this, they don't need to be in the refrigerator. Like, the worst that might happen is if there's a big surface area exposed, you might get a little floating island of some mold on there. I mean, any food will last much longer if the vessel is completely full or nearly completely full. Like, most food degradation has to do with oxygen, whether it's surface mold growing, whether it's oxidation of nutrients. So, just try to bear that in mind, that, package things in ways that minimize airspace and air exposure.
Great. So Joyce writes that she's a total newbie, many food sensitivities, gluten-free, interested in keeping things simple and having success. So for her, would making buckwheat sourdough be a good first project?
Yeah, so buckwheat sourdough is a recipe that is in Wild Fermentation. And it's really just like the easiest and the most delicious, totally gluten-free bread that you can make a loaf and slice and make sandwiches with, that I have had. In terms of like overall, like for a total newbie, I mean, I would recommend that almost anybody start with sauerkraut, start with making vegetables. But, especially if you're someone who, can't eat gluten and is missing bread, and you want to, make something bread-like that won't make you feel bad, I would highly recommend the buckwheat bread. I mean, I can very briefly describe the process. I mean, it's deceptively simple. You take raw, whole buckwheat groats, about 3 cups of them will make about a loaf of bread. Soak them in water overnight. Then strain out, drain off that soaking water, which will develop sort of mucilaginous strands. Get rid of that. And then put it in the blender with a little bit of fresh water, and then blend it into a smooth paste. Add just as much water as you need for the blender to be able to blend it into a smooth paste. And then rise that batter for about 24 hours and put it in a vessel big enough for it to like double in size, because it will. And then mix some salt in, and then put it in a loaf pan. The key to having a good loaf is you need to heavily oil that pan. And then what I do is I take sesame seeds, and I just shake a layer of sesame seeds on the bottom and the corners and as much of the sides as I can, because it's a very sticky batter. This, the mucilaginousness of the grain is what holds it together into a nice loaf of bread, but it's also sticky. It'll want to stick to the sides. So the sesame seeds or other little seeds just, you know, help it not stick so bad so you can get the loaf out. Then you bake it for a little more than an hour at like 350 degrees Fahrenheit. Then you take it out, leave it in the pan to cool for like 10 or 15 minutes, then take a knife, run it around the edges and take it out of there. And I mean, it's a beautiful, straightforward process. I mean, most of the fermentation of grains is really, really straightforward. It's water. Like the thing that, like, just like a cabbage, you know, and all vegetables have lactic acid bacteria, all grains have lactic acid bacteria and yeast. You know, it's just the fact that they are dry in their mature state is what gives them their shelf stability. And nobody's ever fermented a grain or a bean in order to preserve it, because they preserve so well in their mature state. All you have to do is keep them dry. But the first step of every fermentation process of grains and beans is adding water. And some of the processes, that's the whole thing, is you just add water. Like I have a recipe for kysil, which is a word from Belarus, where my grandparents came from. But kysil is fermented oats. So, you know, I made like the liquid becomes like oat milk. I mean, it's so rich, it's so flavorful and delicious. And then the oats themselves, you add a little bit of fresh water and cook it into the creamiest oatmeal you've ever had. So, you know, just the fermentation just makes everything creamier and easier to digest and more flavorful. And that's the whole thing. There's nothing besides soaking that's involved. You know, something like Indian dosas, which are these, you know, rice and lentil crepes. You soak them and then you put them in a blender, just like with the buckwheat bread, blend them into a batter, let that batter rise and ferment, and then you create these, you know, beautiful little crispy crepes out of them. But, you know, the fermentation of you know, grains and beans, you know, I mean, there are certainly examples of more, you know, complicated ones where you're trying to get some specific organism to grow. But, you know, most of the simple ones they're wild fermentation. It's basically, you know, supporting the growth of whatever's dominant on them, you know, which tends to be lactic acid bacteria and yeast.
Zona asks, can you please tell us about fermenting fruit, including lemons and oranges, if it's possible to ferment?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, I would say that you know, for most people, the highest and best use of fruit for fermentation would be to make alcohol. So, you know, wine, cider, this whole world of country wines where, you know, you can make wine out of anything flavorful. You make a sugar water solution, and then you infuse it with your elderberries or your sumac flowers or dandelions or blueberries or blackberries or whatever. So that's one direction, is you can go in like an alcoholic direction with fruit. But you can also make pickles out of fruit. I mean, especially in Russian cuisine, there's a lot of pickling. I mean, it's not so much generally out of like citrus, but, you know, crab apples or cherries or even watermelons. You know, there's a lot of pickling. So if you sort of introduce salt, then that will typically create an environment that is going to favor the lactic acid bacteria, which are also always present on fruit. So, and then, you know, there's all kinds of hybrid traditions. So like there's a style of kimchi that people in Korea enjoy that's fruit kimchi, where, you know, in addition to, you know, some cabbage and some spices, you'll have some fruit, maybe some pears, maybe some apples. I love to like mix a lot of different fruits in. I mean, one year I was in the Pacific Northwest in like July, and we made this like this beautiful like multi-berry fruit kimchi. So you know, you can definitely like pickle fruit like that. Then if we look at like, Indian style pickles or North African style pickles, there's a lot of preserving lemons and limes using fermentation and a lot of salt. So like, I mean, I don't have it in easy reach. It's on the other side of the room, but like I have a lime pickle that I made like 2 years ago. And I mean, I'm almost at the end of it, but it's never been in the refrigerator. I basically quartered the limes and left them connected at the end. And then I made a mixture of, salt and all of these Indian spices. I mean, I can't off the top of my head remember exactly what spices I used. And then I just sort of packed that spice mixture into the center of each of the limes. And then I packed all the limes into a jar. And then I did this thing that comes up in a lot of Indian pickling recipes where like I put them out in the sun and then I'd bring them in at night. And then I'd put them out in the sun for, for like a week. I would put it out whenever it was sunny. And, I think that the idea is that the sun, helps draw juices out of the vegetables. The salt helps also. But, over time it gets juicier and the vegetables get submerged. And in that sweet, salty, sour, spicy medium, there's a little bit of fermentation, and the physicality and flavor of the limes is really well preserved. So yeah, there's a lot of different ways you can ferment fruit. Personally, I would generally think of wine as the as the first thing. Yeah.
Great. So Trevor asks, you traveled to Asia, and I followed and enjoyed that journey. Thank you. I'm just wondering if you have a list of places that would be beneficial to visit. When I go to Japan next, I plan to try to visit some fermentation business if I can, or areas that would be of interest.
Well, I mean, if you're interested in world fermentation traditions, there's no area of the world that would not be of interest. I mean, there's just, there's different kinds of fermentation processes everywhere. Now, Japan is a place where, there's a, there's a high population density, but there's also, just a huge amount of fermentation. I mean, fermentation processes have a really, kind of central role in Japanese cuisine. And so I would say wherever you're going in Japan, I mean, the production of fermented foods is extremely decentralized in Japan. And, every town beyond the tiniest size is going to have a miso shop. They're going to have a sake maker. And so, you can find these things. I mean, I wouldn't know enough to specifically say like, oh, this region of Japan you should definitely go to, or that region of Japan. But, fermentation is so prominent in Japanese cuisine that I think wherever you go, you would, be able to find producers who would be, happy to, show you what they're doing. Sometimes, I mean, people have really wanted to know, like, okay, where in the world is there the most fermentation? And I mean, I just, at this point, I think, sure, there might be places like, Japan where it's more obvious how important the role of fermentation is in people's diets and lives. But I mean, I just think everywhere. I mean, fermentation is so integral to how people eat. So like, you take a place like Turkey, and I have not been to Turkey, but, you take a simple food like yogurt, which comes from Turkey, and there's all these subsidiary foods that are based on yogurt. So like I've had just dry blocks of yogurt that you just sort of chew on and gnaw on and suck on. And, I mean, it could really like, I could see how that would be a great like traveling food, or, it would be easy to carry, it could occupy you for a long time, and you'd have the feeling that you're like getting something out of it. And then in this new book, I have a section on tarhana, which is this amazing Turkish food that I learned about from a Turkish food writer that I met at a conference. But tarhana is basically yogurt and some form of wheat flour or bulgur, and often vegetables or sometimes fruit also mixed in. And then, they're all mixed together and fermented together, and then it's dried. And then it becomes the basis for soups. So it's like, you could think of it as like, the world's first instant soup, because it was all these like flavorful dehydrated elements that you could simply pour boiling water on them and have something, really delicious and substantive to eat, or you could use it as for the basis of, let's say you're making a stew and you just want some to thicken it up and give it some flavor, you could use it in an application like that as well. But, really what I'm trying to get at is like fermentation's everywhere. I mean, throughout Central and South America, throughout Africa, everywhere in the world, people have distinctive fermentation practices. So it's not, just certain regions. It's really a global phenomenon.
Are there patterns that you see of how fermentation styles differ in general regions?
Well, I mean, I would say the biggest patterns I see have to do with climate. So, in the tropics, there's never a long season without food. So, the focus of fermentation is a little bit less on seasonal preservation and, more on detoxifying things, because certain important tropical foods like cassava and taro, have compounds in them that can be toxic that are broken down by fermentation. So, detoxifying food becomes more important. Whereas, in the, far northern places and the far southern places, preservation becomes more important. I mean, like in the Arctic regions of the world, I mean, people never could have settled like in, the northern parts of Canada and Alaska and Siberia and Greenland. And so, the ability of humans to habitate those regions is, purely a function of people having effective, means to preserve food from, the summer, which is a season of, incredible plenty in these far northern places, to get people through the winter where, it's hard to do anything and it's hard to, access fresh food resources. So, I mean, that's really the biggest patterns I would see have to do with, sort of, general weather and climate.
Deanne asks or says, Fab Stories. Any tips for small kitchen space, 650 square feet apartment? What are some of the concerns in terms of cross-pollination? Is that a myth, ? And then she writes, I make booch. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that. B-O-O-C-H.
Yeah.
Heard you have to be careful with what's in the air. And then one more thing, if you have time, can you expand upon the notion of how our brains are affected? So a few pieces in there.
Yeah, okay. So, okay, in terms of small space, you just have to decide what you want to do. Like, let's say you're making sauerkraut. Like this is a, a quart-sized, liter-sized jar. This does not take up a lot of space. You can use a tiny little cutting board and a knife and shred your vegetables at any scale. So like a liter-sized vessel will take about 1 kilo of vegetables to fill up. And, and then this can just sit on your counter somewhere. You can put it on the shelf, whatever. I mean, I get that in a small kitchen, you can't, have 100 projects going at once. But, that just means that you have to decide which ones you want to do. Now, I like that you use the word cross-pollination. Usually that's phrased as cross-contamination. Well, I became friendly with this woman who passed away last year. Her name is Betty Steckmeyer. And the way I got to know her is that she started a business with her husband Gordon in the 70s in California that was called Gem Cultures. And they were the I mean, the business still exists. Betty and Gordon's daughter is running the business. But they were the first people, you know, selling starter cultures to home fermenters starting in the 70s. And in the basement of their home, Betty set up a little commercial kitchen, and, you know, in basically like an 8-foot square space, she was propagating kefir grains and kombucha mothers and tempeh starter and she just, you know, she was producing and selling all of these different starters from a really small space, and she claims that she never experienced any cross-contamination. I mean, in general, I would say that I haven't. I mean, when I noticed it is when I'm trying to grow out the pure culture mold starters. So like I use the same incubation space, like a defunct refrigerator, for making koji and for making tempeh. And, you know, I know from the literature that historically, you know, koji always, you know, frequently had rhizopus in it, which is the tempeh organism, and tempeh often had aspergillus in it, which is the koji organism. So, you know, I mean, this idea of working with pure cultures is a 20th century idea, facilitated exclusively by microbiology. Like historically, nobody was able to isolate singular organisms and work with singular organisms. So, you know, all traditional fermentation is working with mixed cultures. Like, you know, right now, you know, if you like to drink beer, we're in a golden age of beer, and you know, just the proliferation of microbreweries, the growth of the market of people who are interested in trying like quirky, different kinds of styles of beer is growing and growing and growing. So one of the movements in beer is sour beers. Now, I would propose that until the 20th century, all beer was sour beer, because there was no such thing as yeast as a separate thing. And yeast is always in the presence of lactic acid bacteria. So, you know, in its natural habitats, if you just capture yeast from a berry or something, it'll always be with lactic acid bacteria. So, you know, I would just say that, you know, people always contended with the presence of lactic acid bacteria in their beer until the 20th century. And then our palates got narrowed. So like, you know, I was visiting my dad a month ago, and, you know, I went to the beer store and I bought a sour beer, and my dad wanted to see what I was drinking, and he had a little taste of it, and he just made this face like, you know, he just couldn't imagine that anyone would want their beer to taste like that. But I mean, I just find it incredibly delicious. Wow, I got off on a tangent. Pure cultures, cross-contamination. Yeah, I mean, you really don't have to worry about cross-contamination. I mean, maybe if you're doing some very, very specific thing, you would need to, but for most home fermentation, it wouldn't matter at all. And generally, it's very minimal, like how much the organisms are affecting one another through the air. More, it's a question of like, what's on the substrate, what's on the flour, what's on the cabbage, you know, to a limited degree, what's on your hands. You know, but I think, you know, I think soap and water, cleanliness is perfectly adequate. There's no need to like use special chemicals to sterilize everything, wear gloves for everything. Just keep reminding yourself, this is not rocket science. Now, there was some question at the end of her series of questions.
You said if you have time, can you expand upon the notion of how our brains are affected?
Well, okay, I can't tell you much. I'm certainly not a neuroscientist or anything like that. But I can tell you that, like, over the last 20 years since the Human Microbiome Project, since, you know, we've had, you know, more and more sophisticated tools to be able to study the community of bacteria in our bodies and, you know, begin to comprehend ways in which they affect our well-being, it has been observed that serotonin and other chemicals that we know affect our brains, you know, how we feel and how we think, are regulated in ways we don't fully understand by bacteria in our intestines. So, you know, the only all I can really offer is general advice. And I feel like, you know, whenever I hear people talking about probiotics in specific terms, it drives me crazy. Like I've heard people saying that like, oh, probiotics will prevent you from getting COVID. There's no data to say that. I mean, maybe we could have wishful thinking and say that, oh, well, bacteria that are likely to improve your immune function, you know, might help to protect you from COVID. But, you know, there's no specific evidence suggesting that, you know, eating fermented foods is going to like prevent the possibility of you getting COVID, for instance. You know, I once saw a kombucha website that claimed that, you know, if you drink kombucha every day, it will prevent your hair from ever going gray. And I can tell you when I read that, my hair didn't look like this. So, you know, not that I drink kombucha every day at all, but I do, you know, I've drunk kombucha on a semi-regular basis since long before my hair was like this. But anyway, you can't believe everything that people say. And I think that, you know, the power of probiotics at this point is best articulated in a really broad way, which is that restoring biodiversity in the gut has the potential to improve digestion, improve immune function, and potentially to improve mental health. But it's really broad. I mean, that's not to say in any given situation, like, you know, oh, you're feeling depressed. Oh, the sauerkraut is going to make you feel better. Like, you know, oh, you're feeling run down and like you might be getting a cold. Oh, this sauerkraut is going to make sure you don't get a cold. You know, oh, you're experiencing constipation. Eat the sauerkraut and it's going to, you know, get you regular again. I wish it were that straightforward, but it's not. But on the other hand, it's something positive that people can do for themselves that may well make a huge difference. I mean, I have heard so many testimonial stories from people who, you know, tell me like they experienced terrible digestive problems for years. They started incorporating, you know, sauerkraut and other live ferments, and their digestion improved. So, I mean, I believe it. There's no reason that it shouldn't. But I think we have to think about these benefits in really general terms. And you know, who cannot benefit from improved digestion and improved immune function?
Thank you. There's so many questions. We're not going to be able to get to half of them, but I think we have time for one more. This is from Hugh. He writes, I like to ferment a jar of ingredients for a frittata for about 10 days. Would there be any benefit to fermenting them for just one day? In other words, is something always better than nothing? Cheers and thanks for the revolution.
Yeah, sure. No, I mean, I have many times volunteered to make coleslaw for some big event, and I'll like ferment it for 2 days, then mix it with mayonnaise. Nobody has to know that it's fermented. You know, a lot of people don't find the flavors of, you know, 6-week-old sauerkraut to be accessible. For some people, the acids that accumulate over such a long period of time makes for too strong of a flavor. So you got to, you know, I mean, my MO is meeting people where they're at. And, you know, in any kind of fermentation, the fermentation byproduct, whether it's lactic acid, acetic acid, alcohol, whatever it is, it's building up over time. And so you can ferment it for a longer time and have a stronger flavor with a fuller accumulation of the fermentation byproduct, or you can do it for a shorter time. And, you know, there's lots of reasons why you might want to do it for a shorter time.
Well, wow. Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Sandor, and sharing these inspiring recipes and wisdom. There were many requests to invite you back to speak after your last talk a few years ago. So I'm glad we've been able to do this. And I believe it's a brave frontier with deep roots in the past that you're revitalizing. I just want to remind everybody you can get Sandor Katz's Fermentation Journeys as well as his other books from Banyen.com. And this new book is destined to be a contemporary classic. Find out more about Sandor Katz's work at wildfermentation.com. And on behalf of Banyen Books, thank you all for coming out today. And thank you, Sandor.
And thank you, Jacob. And thank you, people who devoted part of your day. And I wish we had time to answer all of the questions.
Well, they can write you at your website. Am I correct?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us for Branches of Wisdom, a podcast of Banyen Books and Sound, Canada's spiritual and healing resource since 1970. Our podcast producer is Jacob Steele. The show is edited by Abdo Habani. Watch all our conversations on YouTube by searching for Banyen Books, or listen on your favorite podcast platform. Please subscribe, follow, like, and leave your reviews and comments. We love to hear from you. For all our live events, books, and more, visit us at banyen.com.